Orla, it's a delight to have you back to Ireland's Edge. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to Kirkagreena this time. Thank you for being with us. When we spoke in June in the National Gallery, we were speaking about the COVID pandemic as we were experiencing it at that time. We discussed the impact of that across the broader society. We discussed the breadth of solutions which are available to us in the arsenal to engage with that. And we discussed how and why we were not taking some of those solutions. You could transpose the frame of that discussion onto the housing discussion that we're going to have. You say that there are a whole range of solutions that are available to us, and yet, as Chris has just described, we're in a situation where the impacts of what we're experiencing in homes, in families, across our society, across the productive capacity of our economy, across individual lives and the futures, are being blighted by the decisions that we're taking. And it's very hard to overstate the huge consequences that we're paying for how we're approaching housing. What are the solutions that you say are available to us?
Thanks, Muireann. You're right, actually. It is right across society, and it is leaving us not only with current problems, but future economic and environmental and social problems in the housing system. We do have solutions. I mean, ultimately, Ireland is not a very densely populated country. We have plenty of land. We have plenty of land near our urban areas, and in fact, we have a lot of vacancy in our towns and villages and suburbs. So we have that opportunity. We are a wealthy country. We have access to finance, both from our productive members of the economy and the ability of the government to borrow, and for other areas that we can tap into to unleash some of this. And we have capacity within ourselves, I suppose, to import materials, to manufacture materials, and for the people who put boots on the ground and put buildings together or repair older buildings. So really it's a case of just putting together those things. None of it is intractable, and it's really a case of how we approach that and how we prioritise where we want to be. You know, immediate emergency response is one thing, and we're doing a lot of patching to get through individual areas of crisis, I suppose, whether it's homelessness or people with disabilities unable to access housing that's suitable, or family accommodation, or accommodation for people who are coming to work in Ireland. There's all sorts of pinch points. And there's a lot of patching going on without really a vision of us as community, because housing is our community.
But we are not understudied in this. We have studied this problem for decades at this stage, right back to some of the seminal reports on this dating from the 1970s, but several others within that. What is your sense of the main characteristics of the problem for where we now find ourselves in this 2021 period, which has some very common threads with what we've experienced before, but also some nuances that have come into the system in the last number of years?
I think there are a number of threads to it. Obviously, we can't talk about this without talking about the crash, which was ultimately a speculative property crash that brought down the banks. So that narrative of protecting the banks is always in the background. And unfortunately, that's also connected with protecting property values and in restoring, you know, what some people might call restoring property values to a level that just is unaffordable to the economy. So that has been a problem of increasing property values. There's also been, I suppose, a political move away from the state engaging directly in that time, and an over-reliance on the private sector to step in to provide housing for people who can't meet their own housing need.
And yet as a state we're spending and set to increase spending at a very significant
Spending
rate.
at very significant levels. And there are times when I suppose that was legitimate. If we go back about maybe 10 years, we had a lot of people who had speculatively bought apartments, for example, as a second property, who weren't able to service those mortgages. So it made sense in some ways for the state to indirectly support the banks by housing people through supporting tenancies in private accommodation. But there came a point when that didn't make sense anymore, but we've stayed with that policy. So up to $1 billion now is being spent in rent supports into the private sector, which is obviously squeezing the private sector. But it's also setting the market to a large extent, because if the state is subventing things by that much, it's setting a floor on the rental market. The other thing that's come out of the crash, I suppose, too, is that the construction industry was very damaged, very, very damaged, and lost a lot of skill at every level, from tradespeople through the professions, through institutional capacity. All of that technical skill and experience, a lot of it was lost. And that hasn't really been supported to recover in any meaningful way, which means that the sectoral capacity is still quite limited.
And if you come back, so we've had another Housing for All document, which does represent re-engagement with the state delivering social housing. It also has a very large continuing role for the private sector in terms of the provision of rental accommodation. It delivers much less on affordability. What are the overall economics behind that policy?
I really don't feel there's been enough analysis of it. More broadly, I suppose there's a number of ways you can read it. Certainly, 20 billion sounds like a lot of money, although I think in the short term, only a certain amount of funding is readily available. It's predicated on other things for funding to come on stream in the later years. More broadly, though, I think it doesn't look to tackle affordability. It looks to support prices at the level they're at more generally. And there's a number of ways of reading it. So on one level, you could read it that the state will subvent half of housing for the next 10 years in some level. But the other side of that is saying that only half of people nationally will be able to afford their own housing, which is a move from where we were in the past, where a much higher percentage of people were able to afford their own housing, and it was wealth creation for their retirement. So if the state is subventing much larger numbers of people, that has implications for pensions and retirement. But more importantly, if you look at the cities, and most particularly Dublin, it's looking at the state heavily subsidising about 2/3 of housing for the next 10 years in Dublin City, and that's really not sustainable at that level, because Dublin will be draining all of the subsidies that should be spread more evenly around the regions and into other cities, at very, very high levels. And it really won't solve the problem for Dublin, because really the problem in Dublin is the vast majority of people are within a certain earning bracket, and those people in the past were generally able to meet their own housing need. Now, it was often a 3-bedroom house that might have been in a low density estate, and they were car dependent commuters. We need them to be living more densely and nearer the city, but in housing they want, and housing that they can afford from their own means, rather than very much relying on what's made available and what's available with subsidy, because as soon as you heavily subsidise.
So where, Orla, is the cost coming in that then necessitates the subsidy that takes it out of the reach of the affordable?
Well, the EU Commission did an interesting report about a year ago, which looked at one of the aspects was affordability in Dublin, and they confirmed, which is my own take on it, is that it isn't construction costs that have driven inflation. It's more likely that there's limited competition in the market and there's a high expectation. So I think the players in the Dublin region particularly have quite a business model that's quite dependent on high land values, high return on land values, and high margins. So we have this strange situation where people think now that a new home in Dublin is 400,000 almost in some parts of the city, a new house. And yet if you go 100 kilometres away, you can buy the same house for 200,000 euros. So, that doesn't make sense that it's construction costs. And again, there's a very strong...
And is it land costs? or what's in the gap?
Some of it is clearly land, and there's been a lot of land speculation, and some of that has been driven by deregulation as well. You know, we've seen a whole series of things over the last number of years to reduce standards, raise height caps. All of these things are very inflationary on land. And then again, when you add subsidies such as Help to Buy and all of the other things, that can also be inflationary. So we haven't really, I suppose, approached it from a point of view which I would see as priority, was how can we engineer a situation where the majority of people can, over their working career, fund their own housing without a high level of support, and then have the wealth building for their retirement, so that they can, which is the Irish model, which is you had a low pension because you didn't have housing costs in retirement. Yeah. And that is also, I suppose, a way of people having security in their lives too, because you'll see a lot of the concern, not only from people renting, is not only the high cost, but it's the insecurity of it. That they have to move, that they can't make the home their own, they can't paint the walls, they can't extend, and that often they have to then move children to different schools because the housing isn't available, or that creates a lot of just churn in society, which people are not comfortable with. We like to know our community, and we like to put down roots.
So on the land side of it, we have newly or strengthened land vacancy. Do you think they will be effective in terms of managing some of what needs to come into stream, in terms of addressing some of that inflated land value within it? Do you have hopes for that being effective?
Well, some of the things in Housing for All that might be seen as being reforms are pushed out into the future. So where we are looking, for example, to capture uplift on land if land is rezoned, we have a lot of zoned land already. So newly zoned land, we're looking at least probably 5 years down the road before that could be captured. So it would seem that some of those reforming measures are limited or delayed, which really isn't going to make any difference in the short term. In terms of planning, we have in the Dublin region, we have 40,000 ready to go permissions. So planning is certainly not a barrier to any of this, and there's probably double that nationally. So the planning system, I suppose, has been used, as a tool to try and engineer some of this, but it isn't really the tool that's needed to re-engineer the affordability. And it's much broader. I think it needs a technical mix of finance, tenure, procurement, design, all of these things.
Before we come back to that, if we talk about, say, some of the other elements of engineering which have gone into the market, what has happened on the regulatory front over the last 5 to 6 years in terms of the standards to which we are now building?
Well, one of the things I think has been very retrograde is a reduction in standards for rental housing. We always had the same standards in Ireland, whether housing was being built for rental or for sale, because people will stay long term in housing, and certainly it's the intention now that there will be probably more people renting longer term. Yeah. We had the same standards. That was deregulated so that rental housing could be built to lower standards.
And when did that happen?
That happened within the last 5 years. There's been a whole series of reducing apartment standards, new standards for build to rent, and as we know, co-living came in with that as well, which was shared accommodation, and then changing the height caps. But the effect of that really has been is retrograde, because people are talking about this rental housing being for people who are migrant workers coming to Ireland, people who are in social housing tenancies, that having a lower standard of housing really isn't acceptable for anybody, and that means people not having balconies and outdoor private space, having more families sharing lifts and stairs, so long corridor access within the buildings, lower standards for things like parking and outdoor amenity, and really importantly a deregulation of the mix in a development. So we have standards in Ireland whereby if you have a new housing development, there will be a requirement in each local authority to meet the local needs. So in some places it will be for family accommodation because there's too many small units. In other places it might be an existing suburb with a lot of houses and they want more smaller units. That was deregulated, and of course international investors always want to build the smaller units with the higher yields. So we've seen a whole series of apartment buildings now being permitted with with studios and one-bedroom apartments, which will mean that you have blocks, very dense blocks, with a lot of people living very, very close together. But no opportunity for families to be in those buildings, no opportunity for people with disabilities, and just a lack of space to live in minimal standards. I mean, where will our artists and musicians live? They can't afford these places, but they also won't have space to do their work or to perform their craft, or to rehearse, or to spread out, to have a hobby, to have guests. When you cram people into minimal sized spaces, it's very restrictive on your life if you can't have guests over for a meal, if you can't have space to accommodate a hoist that you need to use your furniture. All of these things really impact and mean that we're creating housing for a very limited demographic. And that a lot of other people will be limited.
Do we know who they are beyond short-term holiday let, is what it sounds like?
Well, you can read through the lines of some of these strategic housing development applications, and you'll see very clearly it's for a specific demographic, and I suppose that's echoed in policy documents as well at government level. But they do talk about this housing not being for people who have children, and therefore there's no need for a creche or a playground. And really, if we're building new communities, we need to be building for families. It's not acceptable that the cities would be for young people and older people and people who are in social housing, and that everybody else is commuting into the suburbs again. It's not a sustainable model environmentally, but it's also not sustainable socially. People want to come to our cities and have vibrant streets and busy restaurants, and it be suitable for everybody.
And so everything that we're talking about in terms of the measures that we're talking about in transport from a climate point, let's come back and have a discussion about the retrofit that needs to be done. But as we talk about a lower carbon lifestyle, as we consider the public health impacts of the built environment and what we are committing to for the next 20 to 30 years, given that we are building during a pandemic, all these things are undercut. They're either on different planes of reality or undercutting, overcutting each other. Is there any squaring of this?
They're all interconnected, you're right, because ultimately, our carbon footprint is what we do every day. And if you're getting into a car in the Midlands to drive to Dublin, or, in the hinterlands of Cork or Limerick, it's the same problem. We need to be living more sustainably. And it doesn't mean living in tower blocks. It means that we're a bit denser, that our houses are a bit closer together, that our gardens are a bit smaller, so that the majority of people can walk to a local shop, can access public transport. There's enough of a population to support that public transport. The children can walk to school safely, and that the communities are places people want to live in. So they are overlapping. To go back to that point about our towns, one of the good initiatives in the policy documents is Towns First, which is that there will be a focus on reinvigorating towns, and that future investment be towards the centre and not to the edges. And I think that is probably key to unlocking some of the challenges in capacity in the construction sector as well, and maybe the pandemic. We need regional employment. We need people not commuting long distances, and to put money into local communities for local refurbishment and upgrade to create housing within our existing urban areas is probably the best initiative we can have. The money will go further.
We have dereliction laws on the books, in the sense, but we're still blighted by a wave of dereliction across our not even major towns and cities, right through our villages. We're blighted with dereliction and vacancy of an unexplained nature. In terms of when we look at, we have official gaps between housing and demand, but if we look at the latent demand, our gap, our undersupply is even more chronic. How does our dereliction and unused rate sit alongside the gap that we have here, and what is necessary? They're not only serviced, they're built to bring them back into useful lives for us?
Well, we're very good at laws in Ireland. We're not great at enforcement. So, we've often dealt with these things in the past, but not followed through. So, in relation to vacancy and dereliction, we don't really tend to follow through. I suppose the other thing
Do
that's...
some authorities?
Some are better than other. I mean, Louth have done some good initiatives on taking back, housing that isn't in use and putting it back into use. So there are certainly initiatives happening that are worthwhile expanding. But more broadly, I suppose, we can see that sectoral interests are very interested in new build and a particular type of new build. And I think sometimes the supply issue is over-exaggerated. Fundamentally, I think it's an affordability crisis as much as anything else. Clearly, there is a supply challenge, and there's a lot of dispute between people over what is actually needed annually. But the other side of it is that the need, the market was actually being met before the pandemic, because the market is at such a high price now that there are very few people in the market for housing. So the issue is more that the need is not the market. So the need is great, and the need for affordable housing is great, but the market is supplying a very small piece of it, and there's limited capacity is going for that more lucrative piece. So when we talk about expanding the market all the time, I think we need to really look at meeting the need all the time, and that is addressing vacancy. We all like to travel around Europe, and we stay in upper floors in buildings in cities that are in vibrant locations. We have lots of those places that can be used, and we have a lot of vacant housing. In the last census, excluding holiday homes, there were 180,000 vacant homes in Ireland. Just 10% of that is probably what will be built this year. So if we can tap into the vacancy in some structured and targeted way, we can also put people into homes very quickly.
And what would a structured and targeted way to engage with that vacancy look like?
Well, internationally, I mean, things like vacant homes officers in local authorities, where they actually go out and look for people, and maybe sometimes it's a case of giving people solutions. Certainly with upper floors in towns, I think there probably are lots of people now who have had businesses struggling over the course of the pandemic, with closures and with lack of income, that maybe have some vacant upper floors or vacant commercial buildings. If we can tap into those people and give them a package of supports in terms of removing some of the regulatory barriers, and a package of supports in tapping into energy retrofit grants and various other things, you could then give people an income stream, because you tie that in then with a local authority lease for 4 or 5 years, and then you have a family coming out of direct provision who have a home, or a family on the homeless list. Or I think more importantly, the very small households of 1, 2 and 3 people are often left at the very end of the queue on housing lists.
Yeah.
Larger families tend to be given priority because obviously they have more children. But if you look at those 1, 2 and 3 person households, the way to solve this is not to put people in large high-rise buildings. The way to do it is to give them privacy and dignity and integration into communities, where they have a bus stop and they have a local shop and they have the dignity of their own front door and the privacy of that. So I think, the smaller households could be very well accommodated in a lot of spaces we have, with a little bit of initiative to turn them around, bring them up to standard, and much quicker. For the cost of building one new house, we could have 4 families or 4 smaller households accommodated. So it would be a good way to use the limited construction capacity, I think, as well.
And Orla, when we look at this in terms of that use of the construction capacity and the long-term implications, we're talking the built environment over decades, and we come back now to the built environment that we're living in this pandemic. One of the aspects of the pandemic that you and I discussed in June was the role of buildings, understanding the nature of transmission and prevention of an airborne disease. We are now facing into December 2021 with what is still an underlying gap in the Irish population's understanding of the role in buildings. What do we need to do differently to be ready for what we're facing in the next few weeks, but what we could face through in 2022 with new variants, what does living with this look like from a risk point of view from buildings?
Well, I think if you speak to people in the built environments and in physics and chemistry, we'll say this is solvable. We have an indoor pandemic. We don't have a mystery illness in some ways. We have a virus that obeys the laws of physics, and we know the laws of physics, and that is entirely predictable in its behaviour, which is why we see at the moment we have a more transmissible variant, but it's behaving just as the previous one, and we are into a season where we seal up our buildings because we're cold. So very much the transmission of this is in the air we breathe, and when the weather is good, we tend to ventilate our buildings freely. We're very comfortable with all the windows open, even though we're inside. And when the weather gets colder, we drive around with recirculating the heat in vehicles, and we close up and we draft proof and we close up chimneys and put in triple glazed windows. So we've been building the conditions of that are favourable to a virus spread, probably accelerated over the last 50 years with the oil crisis and climate change, and we have created enough of these petri dishes that the virus can perpetuate and grow very quickly. But that's solvable. You know, we have been here in the past. We have been through previous pandemics that were solved with solving the indoor air quality problem. Going back centuries, Florence Nightingale had cracked this with the redesign of hospital wards, all designed around ventilation and windows, and spoke about the fact that if there is infection, it's just carelessness or ignorance, that there's no reason for there to be infection anywhere. Right through the Spanish flu and how different places dealt with that and how successfully some did suppression and others didn't. And it really comes down to recognising that if you can target the hotspots where there's a lot of spread, numerically you can suppress the pandemic. You don't need to stop every single transmission. You don't need to track down every transmission. You need to track down the places where many people can be infected at once, or the conditions where that can happen. And I think we have been really slow to explain that to people in Ireland. Part of the, I suppose, schools are safe narrative was denying the physics, and similarly with care homes and hospitals and transportation, and people's private homes. Yeah. There are very many simple things that people can do as soon as they really understand what they need to do and understand it on a day-to-day level. We've had huge compliance with masks and with vaccine uptake in Ireland. I think there's no doubt that people will just really step up when they're asked to do the right thing, and it's just a matter of telling them.
You will continue to be calling for increased masking and increased ventilation over the next few weeks and going into 2022.
I think masking in the longer term, masking is short term because our community cases are so high. We really have to assume everybody might be infectious at the moment because our community cases are so high. So masking is a response to those conditions. It's not a permanent solution. The permanent solution is an invisible fix in buildings so that we get back to living as we were. The vast majority of our buildings are probably low risk. As soon as we start measuring it, we can tick off the list the low risk ones, or we can reduce their occupancy or do a few tweaks, and we can really target the high risk ones. And then you get to a situation where mathematically there may be a trickle in the background, there may be some transmission, but there isn't enough for it to rule our lives.
And that's where we need to get to in 2022. Thank you for your contribution, not only here, but to that national debate and commentating in Ireland. And it was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Muireann.